Have you noticed that the last several episodes, and maybe the bulk of most of the episodes we've seen so far going through Genesis, um, have been rough? Like, the last one with God doing two things, kicking out, allowing Hagar and Ishmael to be kicked out into the desert and going through the near sacrifice of Isaac. Before that, Sodom and Gomorrah. And, you know, so many of the stories that go before that being so difficult. Um, let me tell you, today you get a break. You get rewarded today with one of the most beautiful, heart touching, life affirming, and love affirming stories in all of Scripture. And unlike the other ones where it starts well and then turns bad, this one just stays good. In fact, this is one of the great chapters, two chapters, in fact, uh, we're looking at today, but mainly the second chapter. One of the great chapters in Scripture that actually give us great principles for life and even leadership. So we get to walk through some of that today. So we're going to be talking about the story of finding Rebekah as a wife for Isaac. And it's really a great narrative about how to make wise decisions. But before we actually get to that, which is in chapter 24, let's deal with what happens in chapter 23. 24 is a really long chapter, 23 is a really short chapter. And basically, in chapter 23, we see the death of Sarah. We're not even going to read it, it's very, very short. But it's important for one reason. One, it's important for us to say goodbye to Sarah, this great woman of faith who made mistakes and sinned just like we all do, but also, did some extraordinary things and started in many ways this great journey of faith that we're still on. Um, but one of the reasons it's so important is when you read through the chapter 23 of Genesis, Sarah dies. Abraham finds a plot of land that he wants to bury her on. He goes to the person who owns the plot of land and says, "Can I buy it from you?" And he says, "No, but you can have it for free. You've come to our land. We want to give it to you. We love Sarah as well, basically." And Abraham says, "No, you're not going to give it to me. I am going to buy it." And he insists on it, and he ends up buying it. And the importance of that is this: Sarah's grave was the first land legally owned by Abraham in the Promised Land. Up until now, he didn't own any land legally. He said to Lot, "You go live there, I'll go live here." But they didn't hold any legal deed to any of the land. It was not theirs yet. They were living on, out in the empty desert that maybe, maybe nobody had laid claim to. I don't know. But this is the first time that the promised land actually become Abraham's land. And Sarah doesn't get to see it. Now, Sarah participates in it because it's where she was buried, but she never saw it. And to me, that's about the only sad part of this, episode today is that Sarah, was so faithful to the promise, and she even helped to, fulfill it in so many ways, but she never saw even the beginning fulfillment of it. She thankfully had Isaac, and she knew that the promise was fulfilled in her son, which was by far more important than the land. But the land was a part of the covenant, and she never saw any of that answered. But immediately upon her death, Abraham is able to buy land, and the beginning of that part of the covenant happens as well. God's answers seldom come in the way we expect. They certainly don't come at the timing that we expect them to. We want them fast. We want them yesterday. And God tends to answer them differently than we expected, and it tends to take way, way longer than we think. And one of Sarah's answers, the answer to one of Sarah's prayers didn't occur until after she passed away. But it did happen. And also the purchase of the land by Abraham rather than having it being given to him shows some of Abraham's integrity. He had every right to receive the land free, but it was a matter of integrity to him to say, "No, I want to own it outright. I want to own it legally. I want to pay for it." And by doing so, it also gives him full legal right. No descendant of this kind person could come to him generations later and say, "Hey, that's really our land. My dad gave it to you. I want it back." Once you've bought it and you've paid for it and you've got the deed, it's yours, no matter what any other descendant might say. They might even come later and say, "Hey, my dad sold it to you at too good a price," or whatever. Doesn't matter. Money changed hands and the deed was signed and it's set. So that's what happens in chapter 23. We're going to spend our time today, though, in chapter 24. In chapter 4, there are not a lot of big lessons, but it's a beautiful story, and there are some really important lessons, as I said earlier, about decision making and about leadership. It's a beautiful story. It's a long chapter, and we're going to read it through. because it's just a beautiful story to read and to hear, having been read. And really, the lesson today is going to be about how to make decisions in a godly way. So let's take a look at it. Chapter 24, beginning with verse 1. Abraham was now very old. Last time we saw him, he was 100. So, right? And the Lord had blessed him in every way. He said to the senior servant in his household, the one in charge of all that he had, put your hand under my thigh. We'll come back to that. I want you to swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and the God of earth, that you will not get a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I am living, but will go to my country and my own relatives and get a wife for my son Isaac. The servant asked him, what if the woman is unwilling to come back with me to this land? Shall I then take your son to the country you came from? Make sure that you do not take my son back there, Abraham said. The Lord, the God of heaven, who brought me out of my father's household and my native land, and who spoke to me and promised me an oath, saying, to your offspring I will give this land, he will send his angel before you, so that you can get a wife for my son from there. Abraham says, don't you dare, if you can't find a wife or if she won't come here, you do not send my son there. This is where we're staying. This is part of the covenant between me and God. Verse 8. If the woman is unwilling to come back with you, then you will be released from this oath of mine. Only do not take my son back there. So the servant put his hand under the thigh of his master Abraham and swore an oath to him concerning this matter. Then the servant left, taking with him 10 of his master's camels loaded with all kinds of good things from his master. He set out for Aram Naharaim and made his way to the town of Nahor. So what happens here? First of all, Abraham sent his servant to get a wife for Isaac from his old homeland. That's what happens in the episode we just read, or the start of the episode that we're just reading right now. This raises immediately two questions: where and why? First of all, where is this place? He ends up in Nahor, in a place called Aram Naharaim. And why? Why did Abraham send his servant there to get a wife for Isaac? And both of them are difficult questions to answer. So, but first of all, the where, which is the least important question, but let's take a look at it. First of all, where did he send him? It says back to my homeland, back to where I used to come from. He ends up in a place named Nahor in a region called Aram Naharaim. So let's take a look at the map. We saw this map, boy, a lot of chapters ago now, a lot of episodes ago, right? And this map here this is where Abraham was from, okay? This is the route that he traveled. We know that because he ended up in Haran, which is where his father-in-law Terah died. And it was only then that he crossed over the Euphrates for the final time and came down into what would be the promised land. He did spend some time in Egypt. That's where he enslaved Hagar, for instance. But he ended up, and so he's living in the area around Hebron. So he's right around here in the area around Hebron when he tells his servant, go back to my homeland and find a wife for Isaac and bring her here. Okay. Now, does that mean all the way back to here? Well, he ended up in this place called Haran, right? Nahor, sorry. He ended up in Nahor. We do not know where Nahor is. We didn't know where was for centuries, and that was found. A whole bunch of other places we have found. Nahor we have not found yet. But just like other places like who knows, at some point it might be found. What we do know, however, is the region that it was in called Aram Naharaim. And here's what we know. Aram is this general area. Later on, we will see people called the Arameans from Aram, this area here. It's actually modern day Turkey today, for the most part, I believe. And the top part of it here is the edge of Turkey. And over here, Naharaim, which today is modern day Iraq, and modern day Baghdad actually is right around here. So the Aram Naharaim region is basically this entire long stretch of land. But the important part of it is that it's on the other side of the Euphrates. It's on the side of the Euphrates where Abraham and his original family were from. So he sends him back to there. Once he gets into the region, he finds this town named Nahor, which again, we don't know where that was from, but that's where he ends up. So that answers the where question as best we're able to answer the where question. The next question, however, is the why question. And the why question is this: why did Abraham want Isaac to have a pagan wife from his old home instead of a pagan wife from his new home? Now, how do we know it's a pagan wife? Because they're all pagans. Abraham and Sarah, who's now dead, and Isaac, right now, as far as we know, Abraham and Isaac are the only people on the face of the earth worshiping Jehovah and not worshiping pagan gods, as far as we know. So they're all pagans. They have not had a revelation of the true God yet. That will come through Abraham, but it hasn't come from him yet. So wherever he goes to get a wife, it's going to be the pagan gods of the nations around him or the pagan gods of the nation where he came from. So why does he go back? There are a couple possibilities. First of all, we can never discount the possibility of racism and ethnic bias, right? I mean, it's a part of human nature. Abraham was a sinful human, just like we're sinful humans. And maybe part of it for Abraham was it's a racial thing. He wanted somebody from who looked like him, who was from his ethnic background, instead of somebody from a different ethnic background where he was. We don't know that. The text doesn't say that, so I'm not giving you that definitively. But I don't think we can discount it as a possibility because that's human nature. It's fallen human nature, but it's human nature. Second, and far more likely, is this. And here's a long explanation. We'll put the whole thing up here for you. And oops, I got to get my head out of the way here. There we go. Okay. Um, Here's the other possibility. A foreigner going over to where he used to live, which is now foreign to him, a foreigner would more likely be devoted to Isaac and his God than someone who still lived near her old family and her old gods. Think about this. In that day, you picked a husband or a wife for your child. That's just the way it was done, with rare exceptions. And so Abraham was going to pick a wife for Isaac. If he picked a wife from the women or the girls, the young ladies in the nations around him, they would still be living in the place where they had been raised and among people who worshiped the gods that they had been raised worshiping. And the likelihood that they would change over and worship the true God while all of their friends and all of their old gods are still around them all the time is pretty slim. People just don't do that, or they very seldom do that. But if he goes to another land, even though they're pagan, and removes her from there, and we'll see later, he doesn't just remove her, she actually gives permission. She comes willingly, which will become a very important part of the story. And she comes willingly back to this place, and she is now no longer around her pagan gods and her family. And remember, the pagan gods of where she lives, or where Abraham came from, are totally different gods than where he's living. So it's not just all pagan gods are the same. They're not. They very distinct personalities, distinct names, distinct so-called powers, and everything else. So if you leave your home and you go to a different land, either you will adopt the new gods of that new land, or more likely, you're going to see the wisdom and the beauty and the truth of the real God who is worshipped by your new father-in-law, Abraham, and your new husband, Isaac, and want to follow the true God. So that's most likely the reason you're going to have you're going to get somebody who is more likely to stay worshiping the true God than to go back to their old ways. Now, before we leave this passage, I mentioned it earlier. Let's go to that weird little spot of putting the hand under the thigh. Why did the servant put his hand under Abraham's thigh to swear an oath? He's asked to do that in 24:2, and he actually does it in 24:9. Well, that's just the way they swore oaths in their day. We will see that several times later through scripture. That's just part of what happens. So, how physically did that happen? Did they sit side by side and then he reached over to the leg this way and put his hand under the thigh? Were they facing each other and you reached out? Either way, that is a place of great vulnerability. And therefore, you've got to trust the person who's doing that. And that's what it's about. This is Abraham saying, and this is the way all their oaths were signed. Not all, but a typical way for oaths to be signed then was, I trust you to carry out this oath, and I trust you so much that I'm going to allow you to put my hand in that very intimate and very vulnerable spot where if you wanted to do me harm, that would be the time you would do me harm. And the fact that I trust you enough to put your hand there in that vulnerable spot also is indication that I trust you enough to carry out this task on my behalf. So it's a position of vulnerability, it's a position of trust, and it's the typical way that they made oaths in that time. Today, we sign a contract. I much prefer that. Thank you very much. Uh, and the reason for signing the contract is it can be shown in court later. Back then, they didn't have paper like we have it today. And so you had to do it in different ways. So then it was between the two people. And that was how you remembered that the oath had been done, because you would remember that positioning of yourselves and that placement of your hands. You would not forget that. So, all of that gets us to where we are now. The servant has now arrived in this place called Nahor. Verse 11. He had the camels kneel down near the well outside the town. It was toward evening, the time when the women go out to draw water. Then he prayed, Lord, God of my master Abraham, make me successful today and show kindness to my master Abraham. See, I am standing beside this spring, and the daughters of the townspeople are coming out to draw water. May it be that when I say to a young woman, please let down your jar that I may have a drink, and she says, drink, and I'll water your camels too. Let her be the one you have chosen for your servant Isaac. By this I will know that you have shown kindness to my master. So, why does he use this test for a wife? It's a really interesting test, a really important one, and a really smart one. Take a look at it. This servant's test had two important characteristics. One, it was a prayer for God's help. God, I need your help. I'm not going to rely on my own wisdom. I'm asking for your help. You are the God of my master, and I'm going to ask you to help me with this. So it was a prayer for God's help, which is important. Secondly, the prayer was based on finding a woman of generosity and of character. The women are coming to the well all day long. And if this woman comes and I ask, hey, can you let down your jar, which means, can you stop doing the job that's going to bring water to your own family, to your own master? Will you pause the job that you're supposed to be here to do to give water to a stranger? Okay. And when I ask that, if she says, yes, I'll do that, and I'll water your camels too, may she be the one. Now, why is that such a big deal? One, first of all, she's going to pause what she came to do to be generous to a stranger. That's important. That shows her generosity and her kindness. Secondly, when she voluntarily offers, she's not asked to do it, but she voluntarily offers to water the camels too. That is huge. Camels famously, right? The hump in the camels, right? We know what, right? At least I think biologically that's where the water gets stored. Maybe not. That's probably one of those urban myths or desert myths. Nevertheless, we know that camels hold a lot of water, like days and days worth of water. It's why they are the transportation for the desert, because they hold hundreds and hundreds of gallons of water, which mean that might have been a job that might have taken her hours to perform, to water the camels for a stranger, and interrupting what she was supposed to have been doing. So to do this means she has extraordinary hospitality, extraordinary generosity, which shows extraordinary character. This reminds me, it's similar to a boss who wants to hire an employee. And as part of the test that the prospective employee doesn't even know is a test, is, hey, let's go out to lunch. And they do that not just so that they can have a conversation over lunch, but so that the potential boss can watch how the potential employee treats the servers at the restaurant. Because a lot of people treat, people who are above them in the pecking order well, but when the waiter or waitress comes to serve them, they're dismissive or even mean, right? That's a big part of what bosses do now. They want to see, how are you going to treat the servers, because we have people, we have janitors and we have servers and we have secretaries and we have people who serve the coffee in our company, and we believe that they should all be treated just as well as you're going to treat the boss. So a lot of people do that as a test, and that's kind of what this is. This is how well are you going to pass the test of generosity, of character, and of kindness to a stranger? So this story now continues on. Start going now. We're at verse 15. Before he had finished praying, I love that, right? The story is so detailed. Even before he had finished praying, Rebekah came out with her jar on her shoulder. She was the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, who was the wife of Abraham's brother, Nahor. Oh, okay. So they're in the place of Nahor, named after Abraham's brother, Nahor, of whom she is the niece, right? Did I get that right? Yeah. Okay. The woman was very beautiful, a virgin. No man had ever slept with her. She went down to the spring, filled her jar, and came up again. I want to pause here for something that I just recently learned from another theologian, a female theologian, not coincidentally. It's an important part of this. Um, as this female theologian laid out recently, and I read and appreciated. In fact, I told her, "Thank you for this. I'll pay attention to this from now on." In the Old Testament, women are often referred to as virgins and as beautiful. We'll see it later on with Sarah. as we go back and dip into the Sarah story. We see it in several other places. A lot of times in the Old Testament, beauty is considered a desirable character trait. It still is today, but in the Old Testament is really mentioned a lot. And having been untouched, having been a virgin, is considered a desirable character trait. In New Testament, the looks of a woman is never mentioned. I didn't realize that. I've been studying the Bible all my life. And I didn't realize until this theologian pointed it out for me. In the Old Testament, she was beautiful, she was beautiful, she was beautiful. Happens a lot. In the New Testament, never mentioned. Character is mentioned in the New Testament. Kindness is mentioned in the New Testament. Modesty is mentioned in the New Testament. Sexual morality is mentioned in the New Testament as important qualifications for women, and they're also mentioned as important qualifications for men. Basically, in the New Testament, women and men are treated as co-equals under Jesus, whereas in the Old Testament, it's never they never talk about, or not never, Absalom was mentioned, but very seldom do they mention how good looking a man is. A couple times it's mentioned, but there's almost an obsession in the Old Testament. But when Jesus comes along, that changes. And our outward appearance matters less and our character matters more. It's an important change that happens with the coming of Jesus in the New Testament. So I thought it was important to mention that. And I love learning something new like that. So the teachings of Jesus always elevate women, always elevate the way we see women, always elevate the way we deal with each other, whether it's racially or ethnically or gender or age or whatever way it is. Knowing Jesus and following the teachings of Jesus elevates everyone. It changes things, even Old Testament to New Testament. All right, let's move along then to verse 17. The servant hurried to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water from your jar." "Drink, my lord," she said, and quickly lowered the jar to her hands and gave him a drink. After she had given him a drink, she said, "I'll draw water for your camels too, until they have had enough to drink." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, ran back to the well to draw more water, and drew enough for all his camels. Without saying a word, the man watched her closely to learn whether or not the Lord had made his journey successful. So this is what's interesting. The servant confirmed that Rebekah would not just promise, but would finish the task that she promised to do. Right? She passed the test, which he saw through to the end. This is an important leadership principle that you can learn anywhere, even outside of Scripture. They call it, you have to inspect what you expect. Right? If you give an assignment to somebody, you've got to make sure they follow through all the way with it. After you know them better, you don't have to follow up with them as much because there's a trust that's earned there. But when you're first checking on someone to see if they're going to be good in leadership or good working for you, whatever, you got to check their work. He's checking her work. She made the promise. That's good. But it's only really good if she actually fulfills it. This is a huge biblical principle of fulfilling your word. In fact, Jesus told a parable. We call it the parable of the two sons in Matthew 21, where he talks about two sons. One son said, "Yeah, Dad, I'll do what you say," and then didn't. And the other son said, "No, I'm not going to do that," but he did. And then Jesus asked, which one fulfilled the will of the Father? And the answer was the one who said, "No, I won't," but actually did it. Actually fulfilling the task is more important than making the promise. So that's what this servant does. He's got the wisdom to know, I got to see this task through to the end. Verse 22. Verse 22. When the camels had finished drinking, the man took out a gold nose ring weighing a beka and two gold bracelets weighing 10 shekels. Then he asked, "Whose daughter are you? Please tell me, is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night?" She answered him, "I am the daughter of Bethuel, the son that Milcah bore to Nahor." And she added, "We have plenty of straw and fodder, as well as room for you to spend the night." Then the man bowed down and worshipped the Lord, saying, "Praise be to the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not abandoned his kindness and faithfulness to my master. As for me, the Lord has led me on the journey to the house of my master's relatives." Remember, the command from Abraham was go back to my family, not just to the region, but find people in my extended family. Back then, that was a good thing for marriage, right? Today, not so much. However, even in this situation, she was far enough removed that she would have even been legal today, I think, if I'm following it correctly or not. Either way, it is exactly what Abraham asked for, and according to the prayer, and according to the correct desire for a person of character and of kindness and of generosity. All right, verse 28. The young woman ran and told her mother's household about these things. Now Rebekah had a brother named Laban. leaving that in there because remember that name Laban, it will come up again. And it's going to be a strange story with a difficult man. Okay. In the next 15 verses, they offer the servant a meal. He says, I'm not going to eat until I get what I came for. He tells them the entire story. We've just read the entire story at the beginning of the chapter. He retells the entire story over 15 verses that we've just read, but now he's telling it to them. And he says, I'm not going to eat until you hear my story, until you say yes to my request. After hearing the entire story over 15 verses, in verse 50, here's what happens. Laban and Bethuel answered, this is from the Lord. We can say nothing to you one way or the other. Here is Rebekah. Take her and go, and let her become the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has directed. Here's the deal. This servant not only goes and does what Abraham and what God wanted him to do, but he makes his decisions. His prayer is wise. His prayer is godly. His prayer is, yes, she's beautiful, but his prayer is not, hey, give me a pretty girl for my, master's son, but I want a woman of character and of generosity. When we make wise decisions in a godly way, it's hard to say no to them, even by people who might want to say no to them. When we make wise decisions in a godly way, yes, you will still get evil people who will resist that. Absolutely, always. But it's amazing how people's hearts will be softened and will agree with you when we make wise decisions in a godly way. Even in this one for Laban, who we find out later isn't the most honest guy, he looks at it and goes, well, that's God. So, yeah, let's do that. They then do in a traditional exchange of gifts. And only then, after the agreement, does he eat with them because now his job is done. Now we jump to verse 54. Then he and the men who were with him ate and drank and spent the night there. When they got up the next morning, he said, send me on my way to my master. But her brother and her mother replied, let the young woman remain with us 10 days or so, then you may go. But he said to them, do not detain me. Now that the Lord has granted success to my journey, send me on my way so I may go to my master. Again, I love this servant. He's not even going to eat until he finds out if he's going to get what he came for. And then after he gets what he came for, he can't wait to get back to his master to show him the results. He's not going to hang around for 10 days. And in that heat, in that desert, with the way they traveled, a 10-day rest would have been welcome. But he's like, I got a job to do and I'm going to get this job done. And then they do something really unusual for their day. Verse 57. Then they said, let's call the young woman and ask her about it. Yes, yes, I love that part of this story. Right up until now, you've got men making decisions for women. You've got fathers making decisions for sons. Okay, fine. But men making decisions for women, they're just being traded back and forth. Hagar was enslaved. When he comes and he says, I want Rebekah, they say, okay, you can have Rebekah. But then they go, you know what? Let's ask her. Finally. Right? Yes, she's a fully engaged adult human being who at least ought to have a say in what is going to completely change her life forever. They involved Rebekah in this decision, which was unheard of in their day. This is another evidence that these were honorable people who respected each other, that they would go so far as to do something that nobody in their day would have done. Everybody in their day considered women to be a possession. That was just what it was. And they said, you know what? No, we're going to be better than that. Yes, we've already made the agreement. Okay, fine. But in their culture, that's what happened. But then they pause and go, let's ask her. It's really amazing. Now, today it would be very different. Today you wouldn't make the agreement without having her involved to begin with. Today you wouldn't have your brother making your decisions for you, or your father, or your uncle. Understood. So but that didn't happen today. That happened thousands of years ago. And for them, for their day, that is a very advanced way of thinking. Okay. Especially when we remember like the Hagar story, right? Abraham enslaved her and raped her, right? We got to remember that. But here with Rebekah, she's involved in the story. She gets to give her own permission, which is so huge and so important and so wonderful part of the story. Somewhere recently, I was having a conversation and somebody made the important point where he said, saying, quote, they were a product of their time, close quote, is not an excuse for people's bad behavior. And I really agree with that. You can't look back and go, well, they had slaves, but they were a product of their time. No, if slavery is wrong, slavery is wrong. And you don't need to you don't have to have lived in the last 150 years to know that slavery is wrong. Read the Bible. And the entire Bible is about freedom from slavery, right? You don't need to be in a culture that sees slavery as wrong in order to see it as wrong. But here's the deal. There is something when we're looking around at our culture or when we're looking back in history that it is important to take the current culture in mind. Um, Saying they're a product of the culture does not excuse bad behavior. Now I'm going to add a but. But if someone is behaving in a way that is better than their culture, even if it's not as good as we would expect they need to do today, if they're behaving in a way better than their culture, we have to give them credit for that. Because there are ways that you're behaving today that you think are fine, that 50 years from now, your grandkids will look back at it and go, I can't believe grandma or grandpa did that. And today we look around, we don't see it. And if we look back 50 years to our parents' behavior and some of their views on racism or gender or whatever, we look back at that and go, how could they have thought of that? How could they have thought that way? And you can't excuse it as not sinful because they were a product of their time. But we also have to look at it and go, but in a time of great racism, were they actually kinder and more gentle and less cruel in their statement about other races than the average person of their time? If so, give them credit for that. It doesn't excuse their racism, but you got to give them credit for having been better than the people around them at the time. There's a balance that we got to do that there. So, uh, one of the ways that we gauge godly decisions is godly decisions are better than what's normal for the culture around us. So we can't look around at the culture and say this is what our culture is doing. We can't look back 50 years and go, well, that's what the culture did. People who are following Jesus should be better than the culture around them. So I think we have to factor that in here. And of course, they were at that time much, much better than the culture around them. Nobody in that culture would have asked the woman's permission, especially not a young, single, unmarried girl. She was the possession of her family. They had every legal right simply to give her away. But they said, you know what? Let's ask her. So what happens when they ask her? Let's take a look at this. This is cool. Verse 58. So they called Rebekah and asked her, will you go with this man? I will go, she said. Now, I'm thinking there was a much longer conversation and they shortened it for this, but that's fine. They asked her. She said yes. That's what matters. Verse 59. So they sent their sister Rebekah on her way, along with her nurse and Abraham's servant and his men. And they blessed Rebekah and said to her, our sister, may you increase to thousands upon thousands. May your offspring possess the cities of their enemies. Then Rebekah and her attendants got ready and mounted the camels and went back with the man. So the servant took Rebekah and left. So they head home, and then, verse 62, now Isaac had come from Bir Lahairoi, for he was living in the Negev. He went out to the field one evening to meditate, and as he looked up, he saw camels approaching. Rebekah also looked up and saw Isaac. She got down from her camel and asked the servant, who is that man in the field coming to meet us? He is my master, the servant answered. So she took her veil and covered herself. That's what you do before you marry, right? Verse 66, then the servant told Isaac all he had done. Isaac brought her into the tent of his mother Sarah, and he married Rebekah. So she became his wife, and he loved her, and Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. 67 verses, long story, but one of the great, beautiful stories of the Bible. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you got some good principles out of it, because the stories turn really bad really quick. Yeah, I know. Next week, we're going to take a look at Isaac's kids, Jacob and Esau. And I think I'm calling the next episode the Bad Parenting Hall of Fame, because Isaac and Rebekah, you start out so well, and it turns so bad so quickly. Well, that's next week. I hope you come back for it, and we'll see the story of Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Esau and some of the worst parenting decisions anybody's ever made. We'll see you then.